Everybody. It's good to see all of you again. And I mentioned Gibran Maciel is our newest hire, and he's already demonstrating some of his skill with that insertion of the bear over there, tromping all over the Capitol. That's a good look. Much appreciated. Nice. Anyway, let's get the meeting started, folks. And there's the Honorable Senator Roger Neelo.
Yeah.
Wonderful. Thanks for joining. Thanks for joining us.
Honorable? I don't know.
Hey, come on. Take it while you can get it.
All right.
So this is the Little Hoover Commission hearing on state grant making and contracting with nonprofits, August 28th, 2025. Good morning. I'm Pedro Nava. I'm the chair of the Little Hoover Commission. And again, thank you for joining us. We have other commissioners who are with us as well. Vice Chair Anthony Cannella. We will be joined by Commissioners Dion Ariner and David Byer. We currently have Commissioner Janice Sidley and Gil Garcetti, and I've been texting with Commissioner Hernandez, who is on his way. And also, we've been joined by Senator Neelo. Also with us are members of the Commission staff, Executive Director Ethan Rarick, Deputy Executive Director Tamar Foster, Project Managers Crystal Beckham, cute hair, Crystal, and Daniel Harris McCoy. We're joined with our newest hire, analyst Gibran Maciel, along with Shara McAllister. Let's do a little bit of housekeeping. We're live streaming today's hearing on Zoom, and we'll have a public comment session at the end of the hearing. Commissioners' audio and video will remain on throughout the hearing. Commissioners, you may mute yourselves if you wish. The video and audio of our hearing witnesses will be turned on when it is their opportunity to speak. Members of the public joining us online are muted during the hearing. If you want to make a public comment, please use the raise hand feature in Zoom by clicking on the hand icon to join our comment queue. Those joining by phone can dial #9 or at star, yeah, it actually looks like *9 to raise their hand, or email us at littlehoover@lhc.ca.gov. Please include the phone number you're using to join the meeting so that staff can identify and unmute you. Staff will be monitoring raised hands and comment requests throughout the hearing. If you're present at our in-person location and would like to comment, please notify one of our staff members. As usual, public comment is limited to 3 minutes per speaker. We are recording this hearing. Afterwards, a permanent link to the video will be posted on our website and uploaded to our YouTube channel. And now to the substance of today's hearing. And I want to compliment staff for the backup material that was provided. I've often said that staff work on these issues is a really handy primer for people who want an overview of the topic that we're discussing. And the work that Crystal has done here is, again, meets that requirement. This hearing continues the Commission's work on examining the relationship between nonprofits and the state of California. And if memory serves me, I think it was Commissioner Sidley who actually brought this to our attention as a consequence of a conversation that she had with someone who wanted, a discussion and an examination of how the state contracts with nonprofits. People ask us how we get our topics, and often they come from commissioners, members of the public, the legislature, the administrative branch. And so this is an example of a commissioner who was approached by someone that later blossomed into one of our full reports. So thank you, Commissioner Sidley. Nonprofits are vital partners for the state, delivering everything from food and housing to healthcare and wildfire resilience. A little known fact is that nonprofits employ about 10% of the state's workforce. So it is a significant number of people who are providing services to folks in California. But we found that our work shows grant-making system creates barriers, and it makes it difficult for nonprofits to serve our communities. The Commission surveyed nearly 400 nonprofits this year, and we found that nearly 40% of nonprofits reported never receiving advance payments, despite legislation authorizing them. 1 in 4 nonprofits waited more than 3 months to be paid, and nearly 3/4 of those reported moderate to severe impacts. including reducing programs, cutting staff, or taking out loans. 2/3 of nonprofits reported burdensome reporting requirements. Now, this is disturbing, particularly in light of what we see as a reduction in federal funding for states, and in particular in California, and an increased need of people in our communities. So the challenges faced by nonprofits raise fundamental questions. Should advance payments be mandatory? Is 25% enough? How can the state ensure timely payment of grants? Now, I think I'd be remiss if I didn't point out at this juncture that Assembly member Greg Hart has really demonstrated significant leadership on this issue with nonprofits. In 2023, he introduced AB 590. In 2024, AB 3017, and in 2025, AB 1039, all legislation designed to facilitate providing funding for nonprofits and making it more convenient for nonprofits to provide services to people. Now, today, we're going to hear from leaders of the nonprofit sector about those issues. I want to thank Commissioners Garcetti and Aaroner for serving on the subcommittee for this study. I want to let the witnesses know, as is our custom with commissioners, you may not have had experience with us before, but in all likelihood, you will be interrupted during your presentation. Our commissioners are well prepared. They've read the background material. They are familiar with the meetings that we conducted earlier. And in all likelihood, they will have questions for you during your presentation. Please don't take offense. That really is a compliment because it indicates the level of interest and concern by commissioners. So let me now talk to Project Manager Crystal Beckham, who organized today's hearing. And I want her to please introduce the first witness.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Our first witness today is Geoff Green. We are welcoming him back today. Mr. Green is the Chief Executive Officer for the California Association of Nonprofits. Welcome, Mr. Green, and thank you for your testimony today. When you're ready, please unmute yourself and turn on your video and begin. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Crystal. And thank you, Chair Nava and members of the Commission. It's wonderful to be back here with you all, here being, of course, our Zoom virtual world. And I really appreciate the work that you've all been doing alongside us and amongst yourselves in continuing to investigate and recommend and try to dig into these critical issues around nonprofit success in our state. So I think this morning what I'll do with the time I have, and by the way, that warning about being interrupted, I welcome it. Interrupt me anytime and I'll offer whatever I can. There's a lot going on here and it all connects at a high level. And I think I want to frame my remarks today around that. There's arguably 5 primary issues and they all center around sort of culture, structure, and business practice of how the state works with the nonprofit sector. When we talk about the nonprofit sector, as you're all aware, we're talking about a vast array, over 100,000 organizations, according to the Attorney General in California alone, of all sizes and shapes, the vast majority of whom are actually non-staffed, all volunteer organizations, and they range all the way up to some of our largest healthcare and educational organizations in the country, really. And those 5 primary issues that we've been wrestling with and that you've been investigating with us are, 1, advanced pay. So I'll talk a bit about what that means and how it has or hasn't worked and what we're likely or would like to see. Prompt payment and the challenges around the speed with which organizations are paid when reimbursement is chosen. And it is still true that reimbursement has been the predominant method of contracting with nonprofits. Flexibility, and this has largely been focused in disaster issues. So when something happens in our state, as it always does and is going to continue to do, are we ready to allow nonprofits to be the flexible responders that they can be and do so well? The 4th is really full cost, and this is often referred to as indirect costs or overhead or administrative coverage, but we like to think of it as full cost. What is the full cost of doing the work, and how can the state be a stronger partner in making that possible? And then the final is just the complexity of the relationship. So we're talking about what we have to do with respect to applications, reporting, and such. So those are the areas that we have been working in. And the goals, I think, can be simplified really to reducing unnecessary barriers in all of these areas, to modernize systems. There's a few things that I think we could just do in the state if there were the will to do so, that would make all of these things go more smoothly, and then appropriately valuing the work of the nonprofit sector. And so that's really what we've been working on. I think it's speaking to advanced pay, and I know you've got quite a bit in your background. I think that's been a wonderful resource. The history, as Chair Navas stated there, is that this is not a new idea. We could find examples of advanced payment in specific programs enabled by the legislature going all the way back to the 1970s, but they were generally one-off experiments. And so what we've learned over that time is advanced pay is a critical tool. And when we take advantage of it, it simply works better for all organizations. And I see a few hands there, so I'll pause for the chair.
I don't know who had their hand up first, but I see Commissioner Sidley, and let's go Sidley and then Garcetti.
So thank you so much
And then Meyer.
for your participation today in our meeting. My question is really, the reasoning, I believe, behind not giving advance pay is, fear of people not using the money properly, things of that nature. And sadly, it comes from a position of a lack of trust, and a lack of trust for the nonprofit world that is doing great work and wonderful things. So in your view, if we go to a model where we're giving advance pay, how do we reassure the public that the monies are properly spent? I don't want to see, oh, we're going to audit you every 10 minutes. I mean, that'd be worse than getting the money ahead of time. So but there needs to be some mechanism by which we can assure the public that public funds are being spent properly. So I'm really curious what you believe is that practice that we can achieve all the goals necessary.
Yeah, I appreciate that, Commissioner. I would answer that in two ways. First of all, I think that the application process or any process going into a contract or a grant is an opportunity to investigate those very issues. Do you trust that, is there a track record to look at? Is there trust that has been built? And in some cases, especially for entities that have long contracted with or granted by the state, that I believe is a primary tool. The other is the contract itself. Those are accountability tools. So an agreement with an entity lays out exactly what's expected, and then of course reporting is to make sure that was done. So I think we find it a little odd that isn't normalized as, those are the accountability tools that any kind of contracting has, and we believe that can be done well. I mean, the extreme version of this on the philanthropy side is what Mackenzie Scott does, where she'll go and she hires a team of folks and they investigate entities and make sure that they're doing good work and look at all outcomes and what's been shared publicly, and then they make unrestricted grant. I mean, that's sort of the extreme end, and that's not what we're proposing for the state to do. But there are lots of ways that folks have found to do that. And we have to remember too that nonprofits are highly transparent. We are by law, we're required to, our filings show, exactly what we're doing and how we're doing it. So I would say I understand that, I think you're right, it is a trust issue, but I would remind us all that there are some accountability tools well established on that.
So based on what you've said, would you be comfortable with a graduated scale if a nonprofit's been in existence for 1 to 5 years? They have to prove themselves 5 to 10 years. Then we can do front end payments. I think that's also probably reverse of what's necessary. The ones just starting out,
Right.
need the money faster. But these rules, these burdensome rules didn't come up just because we wanted to be burdensome. There is a requirement to make sure that public funds are spent properly. So I'm just looking for that line where, and I hear what you're saying, that the application process, the contract are the tools, but then are we going to make sure contracts are 1 year, 6 months? I'm looking for where you're comfortable with progress and public is comfortable with progress.
Right. I don't know that I would we would not recommend that it be graduated along the lines of length of relationship. Because as you pointed out, the most critical place is for the small entities that are doing the work that no one else can do. And that's what we have to remember, is that the state comes to the nonprofit sector, generally speaking, to do things that the for-profit private sector won't do because there's no profit motive in it. And the public sector can't do for whatever reason. I mean, there's certain kinds of flexibility and community credibility that we can bring. And it is those smaller entities that actually need it. I would tell you the other bill, and we didn't have it in the background, or I don't think this time, was we had been advancing a bill that would have been 100% payment for small grants upfront under a certain level. And I mean, think about this. The way we look at it is think about what we do with for-profit contractors. You know, you always have an initial deposit or an upfront chunk of money to get going on a project. And that's really what we see here, is just,
I can assure you, not with the government, you don't. Being the former general counsel at the Port of Los Angeles, we didn't pay anything until you did something. So
fair enough. Fair enough. Well, I think what we need to think about is, you know, that has to be calibrated with what's the job being asked and why. And if you've got an entity that can do something, you know, I will say that this has to do with a prompt payment issue too, and we'll get into that, I know, later. But you know, we've had members of public agencies say to us in out loud that part of the reason they're slow to pay is that they earn money on what they're holding on to. And I know I don't think anyone would try to defend that publicly, that the essentially small nonprofits floating debt for the state would be an appropriate strategy. And so we just have to look at what the capacity is and what the job is being asked. So we're always supportive of accountability and transparency. That's sort of how we're built. But what we're asking for here is to make sure that the resources are there to do the job.
thank you.
When the job's needed.
Mr. Garcetti, please.
Thank you, Mr. Green. Thank you very much for being here. Your testimony, your availability is very important, I think, for all of us. I have the privilege, have had the privilege for a number of years of sitting on nonprofits, 4 to be exact. One of them is probably the oldest nonprofit in California, the John Dora Haynes Foundation. And in all the foundations we have where we have given money to an organization, an individual, whatever it might be, we run into the problem that Commissioner Sidley ran into. I said, okay, when can we give the money? If it's a new one, I agree entirely with what you said. They are the critical ones that you have to gamble on a little bit. But if you think they're good enough, then go ahead, start with it. But the key is, what we have learned is you have to have follow-up with them. And that follow-up comes in the way of something written. It could be with a new organization every 6 months. We want a 1-page follow-up. How have you used the money? What's going on? What are the difficulties? Is there something that we can do to help? And certainly we want a fuller explanation at the end of the year. That is very, very important for us. And we found, especially in the Haynes Foundation, and we deal primarily with academics who are always looking for money, but sometimes don't always tell you what they're doing with the money until the very end, and it's not quite what you thought they were going to be doing, or they did, and it doesn't come out the way. So there's reason for that. The other question or area I wanted to explore with you, you named five areas of great concern. What is the most difficult issue for your organization to deal with itself of the 5?
Of California Association of Nonprofits,
Yeah.
Specifically? Well, you know, we're in a slightly different, I mean, our revenue streams are not generally with public entities. So we don't suffer that. Our members certainly do. I think in the cases where it's a matter of, you know, just the top line biggest challenge, it would be the speed of resources moving. Whether it's advanced pay, whether, you know, but we don't actually have that problem directly because our revenue streams are based on membership grants, as well as the subsidiary that we own. So,
okay, for the organizations you represent, what is the toughest issue that you are working with them on and dealing that we are taking a look at or should be looking at?
I think that the longest standing ones that have always been there are the full cost coverage question. So are we really paying for the work, or are they needing to go scramble to find other resources to fill the hole? And just the complexity of the back and forth relationship. I think those two things above all would smooth out a lot of it. But again, these are all very much connected. So I have a hard time picking a favorite child, if you will, on this. But those are the longest standing ones.
Yeah, I'll make one observation. I feel for the small organizations when they have to start dealing with the funder a number of times, because this takes time away from what they were giving them money to do. So I have that a true understanding, because I've talked to some of the people in those organizations who said, we're spending so much of our time just dealing with the issues that our funder wants us to look at. So that's just an observation. Thank you very much for being here.
Yeah, appreciate that. Thank you, Commissioner.
Thank you. Let me turn to Commissioner Byer.
Thank you, and thank you for your testimony. Much like Commissioner Garcetti, I've been on nonprofit boards, I hate to say it, for more than 50 years. So I am very sympathetic with the issues that you raised. But I want to go back to Commissioner Sidley's question with a little sharper knife, perhaps. It's pretty clear that there is a suspicion of nonprofits who have ripped off taxpayers. And it's not a big surprise. It's in newspapers in Orange County and San Francisco and other places. And the facts can be really bad. Think of the United Way of America, which was audited, vetted, but full of scandal and removal of the CEO. So I don't think there's anything per se magical about nonprofits and the temptation of conflicts of interest or corruption. The question really is what Commissioner Sidley asked: how do we improve the process so that it's less onerous and more accountable? Not stressing that current law is fine and that there is accountability, because I don't think the public necessarily believes that. So how do we simultaneously improve the payment system so that people are paid potentially more upfront, meaning more frequently, greater amounts, that the payment is prompt and that it's full? As you say, it's not overhead, it's full payment for services rendered. And to some extent, it is how do you balance the competing priorities on investigation and making sure that people are doing what they say they're going to do. And there's a phrase that we used in an earlier investigation, which is we want to avoid procedural fetishes. That is the investigation just for the sake of an investigation. So is there a model in any city or state that has done better at preventing fraud and abuse in the nonprofit sector that we could learn from in California?
Well, I appreciate that, Commissioner, and thank you for your service on all those boards all those years. We rely on that. I think your comment that there's nothing magical about nonprofits, we would all agree with. These are businesses like other businesses. The difference is that they're not owned privately for anyone's benefit, and they're done in the public service. That aside, the structures are wildly diverse. I think there's a couple of things I would observe to answer your question. One is there's tends to be a pretty vast cultural difference between the way a state works, especially a state the size of California, and the way a small grassroots community organization works. So a lot of the struggle in answering the questions in the right way, using the right tools, comes from that just disconnect. And so that's where flexibility on the state's part is what we would ask. And we all understand that you get into a habit, every organization does, of how you do your work. And of course, agency to agency, that varies in California. But those that have closer relationships with their partners, the nonprofit partners, and those who have actually matched somewhat of the cultural needs of what information the agency or the state funder wants with the way that the nonprofit works, that tends to help. I can't answer whether there's a better, a county or a city somewhere that has done this better. We have these conversations with the Department of Justice regularly about the registry and oversight on that side, and we talk about how no one wants a bad actor in the sector less than the nonprofit sector. One scandal, and we have a lot of homework to catch up and talk about and do. So we want that transparency and that good behavior is probably more than anyone, because that's really our bread and butter and what we depend on. I think the balance between how to get the right information it has a lot to do with the front end homework, honestly. To know who it is you're working with and have the right questions. In the private foundation funder world, there's a lot of flexibility and a range of practices from really bad to really wonderful, and that includes everything from helping to fund the actual process of making the match in the application to doing reporting that's much more frequent but much simpler. There are even foundations that ask for regular check-ins, but they're essentially meetings with a little bit of data behind them. So I think there's just a lot of different methods that the state could experiment with. And we've seen a few of those, but overwhelmingly, nonprofits are asked to fit into a much larger bureaucratic system, which just for the smaller entities is a real stretch. And that's where a lot of that time that you reference gets, we would argue, wasted on both sides.
Well, I happen to be the treasurer and chairman of the finance committee of a small nonprofit who this year, for the first time, we went through the audit process. And I'm a big fan of this group, but we learned a lot from the audit process. And so I agree with you that period of history for the organization is not the right criteria, but whether an organization has been audited is, to me, a singular mark, because it's set by independent financial considerations. I read a lot of 990 forms when I'm trying to decide whether to give money to somebody. They're helpful, but they're not all that useful as a narrative. So I guess what I'm getting at is, I think one of the things we could potentially recommend is a set of best practices that facilitates the state triaging the nonprofit recipients into, let's call it zones of concern. The biggest nonprofits in terms of amount of money received from the state are largely homeless, housing, mental health. And the amount of money that's going into them is in the billions of dollars. So hearing from and getting best practices in that sector would go a long way to, I think, reassuring the public that their money's being well spent. There's a suspicion of Prop 1 and how it's being spent. Dealing with that could be helpful to the entire sector. So second, educating grant makers and auditors within the state government on best practices, whether it's the federal inspector general process or other states who use inspector generals, to try and avoid nitpicking for the sake of activity as opposed to trying to improve the system. So I think the more you all could come forward with recommendations about how to reassure the public as opposed to defending what the current rule is. It doesn't mean that we're critical of you or your organizations, but rather acceptance of a political reality that there are too many nonprofits who've been caught up in scandal. And I live in San Francisco, and we've had more than our fair share of people with housing in Aruba and diamonds in the trunk of cars.
Yeah, no, I get those calls from reporters frequently, unfortunately. When those happen, they reach out. So I agree with you that it's best practices, and that is something we do. Our agency, our association is largely about education and translating what policy means to the field and back to and vice versa. There's a couple of examples I can think of in recent history that have to do with some of our recommendations. One is actually out of Los Angeles, that in the recent measure that was passed there, this question of how does work get compensated? The advisory group that got together on Measure A actually in advance worked with labor, public sector, private sector, nonprofit, and there was an advisory council established essentially. And they started with sort of first principles, and first principles included pay equity, so that no matter which kind of entity was executing on those public dollars, whatever the need was, that they were being compensated in a fair and equitable manner, whether it was a public or private entity. So there's ways that standards can be set in advance. That's where guidance coming from other entities, other agencies can be really useful. I would argue this, and last week we actually proposed this publicly at the joint hearing of the Assembly and Senate Select Committees on the Nonprofit Sector, which are chaired respectively by Senator Monique Limon and Assemblymember Greg Hart. And we've been working for the last year or so on an Office of Nonprofit Empowerment at a state level. We believe that a single hub at the state level could really help set some standards, educate, push out best practices, advocate for good experiments that have gone well, and help an agency learn from another. Right now, there is no central entity at a state level, and that would also give us a primary partner out in the field in the nonprofit sector. So I think there are things that would be highly efficient. They would not cost a lot of money, and they would help all the things that you're saying there actually happen. And I think that you mentioned the audit is a great tool. I agreed. And when I think everyone here knows, in California, it's the $2 million mark. When your budget hits $2 million, it's required. Below that, it's optional. And yet you could normalize other kinds of practices well below that $2 million mark of financial review and use those as tools. I'm a big fan of that. In fact, I sit on some small boards that are not quite at that 2 million level, and I've advocated that we go ahead and do a preliminary audit just so that we're checking our own systems. So I think that's right. And there are examples of that all over the state.
Thank you.
Commissioner Aaroner.
Yes, thank you. Good morning, and thanks so much, Mr. Green, for your testimony. A couple of comments. I'm also somebody who has sat on boards for maybe almost 50 years now, and I currently sit on probably the largest child welfare agency in the state. And one of them is the auditing issue, right? Using the use of audits. And there are audits and there are audits, right? From what I learned when I was in the legislature from the National Association of whatever it was, accountants or whatever, was there are different levels of audits, right? And depends, I think, on the size of your organization very often as to what level of audit you want, that kind of thing. And also what government's requiring, because government who gives money very often says, here's the level of audit we want to see, right? If the government's not doing the audits, they can be very specific about what they want to see. But the other thing I've been thinking about being a board member, right, is board development. Who sits on boards is incredibly important, right? And I think very often when we see the headline above the fold in the newspaper, right, and look and read the story about some organization that is just, it's out of control. I think very often it's because of who's on the board, how the board got selected, whether or not there are requirements, right? All of those kinds of things. I always, the first question for me, if I'm being invited to a board, is, do you have board insurance? Right? Because if you don't have board insurance, I'm not, I can see Jose sitting there saying, I'm not sitting on your board if you don't have board insurance. Sorry. I'm not stupid or foolish, right? But having said that, the composition of boards is incredibly important. Because you're taking on a responsibility, right? A fiduciary responsibility, let alone a policy responsibility in regards to what the outcomes are that your organization is looking for, whoever you're providing those services to. And so I just lived through here a very small organization that I had been involved with from the beginning, right? That just went under, and trying to save it. Right. And just to figure out, I mean, it got down to a board of 2 people. You can't have a board of 2 people. I'm sorry, everybody. There have to be more people on a board. What happened? Why wasn't the community aware even that this board, but that they were having a problem, right? And so there's got to, I'm convinced that a lot of it has to do with who sits on boards, how responsible they feel as a board member, let alone the hiring they do, most importantly, of the CEO of the organization, right? And then, how that all plays out. And then the other piece is the application process, right? Because I think you have a point there, having been through the application process and stuff, that is a place where things can be vetted, obviously, right? If the state and the state's, application process, a lot of places is probably not the best example always of how it should be working. Certainly their contracting processes, right, in the for-profit sector, have significant issues all the time. They're very often behind in what's really going on in a sector, and so they don't even know how to ask, how to put out the RFP. And so the simplifying would help a lot. I think particularly for small organizations, language is an issue. Language is an issue for the very small guys, right? Very often that's the purpose is to work with the communities where English is not the first language, that kind of thing. How do you simplify all of that? I like your idea of having a central place at some point, because we need to standardize some of this, right? Each department does its own, right? The payment processes are, excuse my language, they're horrendous, right? I live in a world right now where it's catch as catch can is when you're going to get reimbursed for whatever your services are. It's hard for nonprofits to live like that. For-profit companies don't live on fact, on saying, well, you pay us when you want to, right?
Right.
Yeah, and the state, for whatever reasons, sometimes is rather callous about it. And so what do we do about that? Because otherwise you can starve a nonprofit very easily. You can just starve them out of business. And we see that all the time. People think that something's wrong with the systems of the programs. It's not that the systems of the programs are a problem. It's that they're being starved because they're not being funded appropriately and timely. So anyway, appreciate your comments.
Yeah. Thank you for that, Commissioner. And yeah, to your first point, that when we were speaking around audits and financial, there really are 3 levels. There's compilation, review, and full audit. And there's actually an additional layer for federal funders. So those that are receiving federal funds have an additional scrutiny on them. So I think that normalizing that, even for small organizations at a lower level, just early, offering resources, and frankly, that gets back to indirect costs too, is that all of those things are costs to the organization. So to simultaneously insist on better systems and internal review and then decline to fund it makes it really difficult for small nonprofits. So when we talk about indirect costs, we're talking about all those. We often use this, and I say it a lot when I'm presenting to groups, but we would never walk into our favorite coffee shop and ask how much for the latte, and they tell you it's $3, and you say, great, I'll give you $1.75 because I don't feel like paying for this part or that part. That doesn't happen. I mean, that's not considered an okay response in private sector. So for nonprofits, it's the same. Is that when we say this is what it costs to really do the work, we mean all of those things, including the accountability and the internal tracking and things like that. And you mentioned, I think communication that's real. There's a different language in the nonprofit sector and the public sector and the large corporate sector. I mean, there's a lot of things that are not easily understood across those lines. So that's where an office of nonprofit empowerment, it's also what we do, helps a lot. And to board governance, I couldn't agree more. I mean, I do a lot of board trainings. And I think one of I think it's sort of a baked in challenge in the nonprofit sector is that people join boards for their passion around the mission. They don't think of it as their fiduciary role, and then they learn that they have a fiduciary role. And so I think the more we can do to constantly remind and train folks that they're being asked to take on a serious job. And yes, D&O insurance is critical for that reason and many others. And there's great examples out there. And then there's a lot of folks that are piecing it together. So all of those things are systems that cost time and resources. And I think if we were recognizing the value of those in transparency and accountability, and then making sure that dollars and resources were available, that we'd get further. So I appreciate all those comments. Thank you.
Senator Neal.
Thank you. A few points. I was trying to take my hand down. Did I successfully do that? Yes, I did.
Yeah.
A few thoughts without necessarily answers, and some of it in reaction to a few comments made. First, Dion's point about there are audits, and that's very true. And fundamentally, there's 2 different kinds of audits. One is financial and one is operational. A financial audit is fairly straightforward. An operational audit is not. You're assessing the operations, and the big question there is, what are the operations? And in particular, in the area of homelessness, an operational audit should assess the success of an organization in achieving the results that are contemplated or demanded by any particular grant. And that gets really squishy. And that squishiness, frankly, is forced by the public sector. So often in the area of homelessness, I hear people talk about outcomes in terms of activities,
Yeah.
not results. And the discussion is, well, we've thrown so much money at it, and that's success. And maybe even we get to the point where people are moved into, say, transitional housing, and that's success. But it really isn't, because the ultimate goal, and I'm on a little bit of a soapbox here, separate and aside just from our topic, but my pet peeve, the objective of any social services program should be ultimately getting people to self-sufficiency. I never hear people say that. And so I rather doubt that we're holding homeless service organizations' feet to the fire relative to the end game. Not that we're going to be successful in doing that all the time, but it's rarely assessed that way. So the strength of an operational audit is going to be in the strength of actually assessing results and not just activities. And I think that would be an important way to assess things. The other thing is the reason that it is a problem for a nonprofit relative to the timeliness of the payment of grant funds, so much upfront and timeliness and all that. The greater the financial strength of the nonprofit organization, the greater it is able to navigate those vagaries, if you will. And a weak financial nonprofit will be much more impacted by that. And sorry if this sounds cavalier, but that needs to be taken into account. And if a nonprofit is going to cease to exist because of some hiccups in payment, maybe they shouldn't have been considered in the first place. Again, maybe that's too harsh, too cavalier, but especially in the area of homelessness, you talk about the attitude of the public. I wish I had a dime for every time I've heard somebody say the homeless industrial complex. In other words, there are so many people out there who are so jaundiced in that area that they believe that organizations are created to perpetuate themselves, not necessarily to solve the problems. That sounds jaundiced, but there are a lot of people that believe that. And so, again, the true operational audit of an organization and an activity, as well as the underlying financial strength of that organization, those are two, I think, very important components of what we're talking about.
Yeah, thank you, Senator. I think you have a couple points there that I think I can offer a response or some color to. One is this notion of the job that nonprofits are being asked to do, and I think that that's really important to determining what's necessary to make that partnership work. And the example that comes to mind for me is I used to run a foundation. We would fund promotores groups before they were broadly embraced. And really, a promotores group is a group of often neighborhood leaders who are trusted, and there may be a public health provider that is out there ready to serve, but there's just not enough trust there. And so those groups got in there, and they're a bridge. They're a small group of folks with the right relationships to bring people to connect to a service they may need. And those organizations, almost by definition, are very small, a lot of volunteer effort. And so I think, to your point about the strength of the finances of an organization being an indicator of its utility or ability to consistently do its work, it really depends on the role. I think when you're talking about massive structural changes like homelessness, I can't think of a more difficult issue to untangle. You need to be talking about everything from systems of compensation to treatment to healthcare to shelter to home building to navigating permitting processes. So yes, we've all seen how difficult those are. And as far as what bar a nonprofit partner might be held to, we would say it always has everything to do with what's the piece of the job that they're being asked to do, assist with, or accomplish. And I think all of those things, when you talk about an audit, an organizational operational audit, those things have to be in parallel, so that the size of the job and the complexity of the job increases dramatically with the organization's particular skill set that they're being asked to lend to the bigger project. I can't help but also bring up the article that came out just after the governor vetoed our bills last fall. And one of them was the Prompt Payment Act. And of course, the governor has been very out front wanting to address homelessness in California. And the headline in the Cal Matters article 48 hours later was that the state's late payment had actually hampered the governor's own initiative there by not paying the nonprofits organizations that the state was leaning on time. So I mean, these things go together, and there's so much about these connected relationships. So I don't think there's a single right answer, but there are some great examples of where it's been done well. And if what we need is somebody to really be pushing those out and sharing those from agency to agency, and helping to just change. Again, I get back to that headline where we started with, a lot of this is culture and structure and business practice based. So.
Thank you. Commissioner Aaron again.
Sorry, I'd forgotten one other thing. Why does the state use nonprofits, right? There are different reasons why the state uses nonprofits. One of them is because it's cheaper, right? It's cheaper than using public employees. And so why not have a nonprofit do the job that maybe a public employee should be doing, but we don't want to pay that kind of money? We have some nonprofits in the world that I live in the human services world, where they are wholly owned subsidiaries of the state of California. The only revenue stream they get is from the state of California and maybe federal dollars, but there are no other dollars coming into them, right? And so it's very easy then not to, to give them maybe 75% of what they really need, right? And then wonder why they struggle and why they have problems and why payment issues, right, are so important. That's not the only reason that we do, that we contract with nonprofits, but it's certainly one of the major ones, that it is cheaper to use a nonprofit than it is to use a public employee, or to use some other entity. And we've got to come to terms with that at some point. I remember there was an organization in San Francisco that provided significant mental health programs and all of that, right? And was being paid, maybe 75% of what the public sector workers were being paid. And finally, the mayor at that time, right, got the message, you can't continue to do this and expect the same results, right? In other words, the high quality results. And so there's got to be a way at some point of having that kind of a discussion about what's the actual cost, right, of the care or the service being provided. And very often we don't want to know what the actual cost is.
Right. I appreciate that, Commissioner. Actually, I want to go back to the comment I made about the model out of Los Angeles. This is why it's so important, is that pay equity was a first principle. And I think it's important to go on the record here, too, to say we do not believe the nonprofit should be the cheaper alternative. And in fact, when that race to the bottom starts, it harms all of us. It certainly harms the nonprofit employees and the staff doing the frontline work. We see that in turnover rates and difficulty in recruitment and hiring, but it also creates conflict with our public employee partners. And so we certainly do not advocate that. And I will say that nonprofits have been complicit at times in the race to the bottom by just not recognizing the real costs or thinking they can make it work. And in the end, that does harm to everyone. So we definitely believe that pay equity, compensation equity principle is where we should start. And then what we can offer that sometimes public agency staff can't is certain kinds of work that don't fit within the public sector structure, and some of that is about sort of experience and trust. Some of that is about, lived experience of nonprofit employees when we're talking about incarcerated individuals coming out of the system. And, you sometimes want somebody who's lived that to be the connector, and that person probably wasn't going to be hired by the public agency. A background check or whatever may have prevented it. So there's a lot of good reasons for the partnerships, but I appreciate you calling out the compensation issue and the real cost issue, because that's really what we want to advocate for. There's one other example I can think of during COVID where just a disconnect between the way public and private systems and nonprofit systems work. And there was, some of the small grant programs that came out early in the pandemic to try to support organizations through the sudden stoppage of work and the stay-at-home orders. And one of the first questions on the application was who owns the business, and it came to a nonprofit. Well, the answer is nobody owns a nonprofit. And that was not, nobody was trying to do anything nefarious there. They just were thinking about the lane in which they typically worked, which is with a private entity that is owned by a person, and we're in a public trust. So those kinds of translations back and forth. And again, I'll go back to this notion of a resource at a state level that can really help agencies adapt. And the other thing I'll say, electronic payment is another great example of something that could just be implemented. That's just a modernization tool. But think of all the time and effort and struggle that could be saved there on both sides. So there's things like that should be, I won't claim anything is simple because we have a massive state, but it would go a long way. So appreciate that.
Perfect. Good. Thank you. Looking at the commissioners, I don't see any other hands up. I want to thank you, Mr. Green. Wonder, are you parked out in front of my house? I mean, we're both from Santa Barbara. That's why I mentioned that. And Geoff and I go back a long ways, actually having both been engaged in helping raise funds for nonprofits. So it's a pleasure to see you. It's always good to hear from you, and thank you for your contribution.
Thank you, Chair Nova. And I'm actually sitting in a hotel room down the street from the Capitol in Sacramento today. So there you go.
You got to be near
in person. I could have said hello to all of you.
Yeah, you go right. Bring you in, have some coffee.
That's
all right.
Well, appreciate the time. Thank you all.
Thank you. So, Crystal.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Our next witness is Kate Gordon. Ms. Gordon is the Chief Executive Officer of California Forward. Ms. Gordon, when you're ready, please unmute yourself and turn on your video and begin your testimony. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Crystal. Thank you, Chair and Commissioners. It's great to be here. I really enjoyed Geoff's testimony, and I will not repeat a lot of what he said. I agree with most of it. But I wanted to talk a little bit about some of the other issues that we have faced as a nonprofit in the state. We also work very closely with a coalition of nonprofits, the California Stewardship Network, which are really regional or local-based economic development organizations and community foundations. And so I'll give some testimony. I will also send it to you in written form after this, really focusing on what we have experienced ourselves and heard from them. One note I wanted to say is that agreeing with what Geoff was talking about why we use nonprofits, we at California Forward, we're really focused on building a more sustainable and resilient and inclusive economy across California's regions. That puts us between a lot of issues that are directly covered by state agencies. That's also true for many of our California Stewardship Network partners. So there isn't a state agency right now that actually does economic development as its key function. There's an entire agency on that. There's not an agency that does higher education. We are at that intersection, and many of our partners are, of economic development, workforce, education, and also on the climate and land use impacts of all those things. There's no place for that at the state. So nonprofits play this really important intersectional role in helping the state deliver on goals where there isn't a single agency that could otherwise do that. So just wanted to add to Geoff's point on that. I'm going to provide a couple of observations from our own work, and I just did a series of interviews with our CSN partners in preparation for this testimony, and also some very specific recommendations, operational recommendations, some of which I think you've already started talking about. I'm not going to focus as much on the advanced payment issue because Geoff really covered that, I think, in depth. So I'll focus on a couple of other challenges. One of them you've heard about, but I think is really important, and that is just the excessive administrative burden issue. Our partners and ourselves, frankly, across the board, reported significant challenges with this. We at California Forward just completed a state grant that required us to detail every task and subtask, the specific staff names and percent of time that they would spend on each of those tasks. Any amendment to that, including amendments to the staff name or percentages, we had to do a grant amendment and have another conversation about the Excel spreadsheet in which that was being tracked, and monthly meetings to discuss each task. This was a $130,000 grant. This was not multi-millions of dollars, just to be clear. And ironically, the grant was focused on improving access to state regulatory processes for underserved communities. So the point of the grant was for us to help the state do a better job at making its own processes easier for people. And this was sort of the burden that we faced. And ultimately, we actually had to hire a consultant specifically just to support us in doing reporting on this grant. I ended up losing money on this grant, and we're not a huge nonprofit, and it's just an example. I'm glad we did the work. The work was important, but it was not actually something that we would do again, to be honest. We're evaluating our relationship with this agency. Another one of our partners reported spending 40+ hours on reporting for on a grant in which they had to use their own funds because the administrative tasks were not funded adequately under the grant. So this is an issue that we're seeing across the board. Other agencies ask for quarterly narrative reports, even when the agency staff sometimes admit they don't read these. One of our partners had a program officer literally tell them, we don't even read the reports. But the nonprofits are spending hours producing these. And so I think it's just a really important issue for these nonprofits. Very related is the issue of the inability to charge sufficient indirect costs. So those indirect costs are really important. They are not kind of fluff, right? These are the ability to hire people, the ability to track costs, the ability to do the reporting necessary internally. Some agencies cap that indirect rate as low as 5%. And the de minimis at the federal level is 15. 15 is what we normally charge at California Forward. That is like, I can track every penny of that. That's very much stuff we actually spend. Worse, some agencies actually require that 5% is split across subcontractors. So if you have to grant out and you're taking like 1% of that 5, then you can only pass through 4% to your subs. And so you're just going down the line, and some of the smallest organizations then end up with zero overhead ability, which is a real problem, especially for small community-based organizations working with low-income populations. We heard, so number one, again, that administrative burden. Number two, inconsistent and changing rules. Organizations are facing changing requirements and unclear guidance. So we heard about rules changing between planning and implementation phases, leaving grantees scrambling to adapt relationships they'd already built with community members. In one case, a grant through a couple of different agencies organized by GoBiz and administered through EDD. In the planning phase, stipends were allowed to be paid to community members, but in the implementation phase, that rule changed. So a set of relationships that had been built with community members then had to change in implementation.
Let me interrupt.
Absolutely.
Sorry.
Yeah, no,
Commissioner Sidley.
But go ahead, please.
So a quick question, and you may not know the answer to this, but is there a state clearinghouse, or does GoBiz have one and everyone else have, just of where the grants go annually? Can I go somewhere to some website and say, you know, this is where the government made grants? Because I think data is a key to solving some of these issues, not all, obviously, but data is key. And if you are, you know, if we have a database, then I can also do a database for the report. You know, if you're dealing in homelessness, you can almost do a checklist with a little narrative to see what you're doing. I mean, it will be a larger discussion, I think, to deal with the senator's issue as to what that audit includes. But certainly I think we can get to some positions if we at least know that everybody can look in one place and say, well, you know, and I'd love to see it for the entire state, but I'm not that naive. So is there one that each government agency has? So there's you know, if I go to GoBiz, I'm going to know all of the grants that they made and just do it in a per annum basis. Does that exist?
I don't know, actually. That's a great question. I do know that on the grantee side, as Geoff said, also different agents, and you just said different agencies use different structures and different database, you know, different portals and different reporting requirements. Definitely do think, and I'll skip to recommendations for a second, and then I see another hand. I do really agree with Geoff and with what many of you have said, which is, can we find some way to have a consistent portal where, for instance, just looking at our grants from the philanthropy side, you know, the Irvine Foundation is an example. We have multiple grants from them over multiple years. Their grant portal already has on it my 990 and my audit records and my insurance records. And we already have all that uploaded. So it reduces my burden in doing a proposal for a new project, but it also allows for instance, you to see what the senator was talking about. You can actually see that the organization has a clean audit and has insurance for its directors and officers. I think that's a really interesting idea to both create a portal that allows for that sort of like the information already be uploaded. It reduces administrative burden. It allows the state to see some of these documents, and potentially on a similar note, could, what about creating, one of our partners had this great idea, creating sort of a list of certified contractors where you're actually updating it every year. If somebody has labor violations, if somebody has an issue, you just no longer have them on your sort of primary list. I think that's not a bad idea to think about sort of centralization.
Commissioner Byer? You're muted,
You're
David.
muted.
Thank you for your testimony. I have two questions. The first one, if you could address, is I looked up your bio, which is amazing. And
Thank you.
maybe you could just summarize all the different things that permitted you to interact from the government or to the government that enables you to reach the conclusions that you are laying out. Because I think you have a lot of credibility given your experience. And so your examples are profound because you have many examples to call on.
Thank you so much. That's so nice of you. Yeah, I think I've spent, I think about at this point, 25 years in the world of either building nonprofits, working at small and large nonprofits, but also the last 5 years in state government in a leadership position, running the Office of Planning and Research under Governor Newsom for his first term, and then in the Biden administration as a senior advisor to Jennifer Granholm, implementing the bipartisan infrastructure bill and the Inflation Reduction Act. So huge amount of experience in my public sector role of getting grants out, right, to multiple organizations and trying to think through exactly these questions of how to work with kind of organizations on the ground, how to really get those kind of place-based and diverse perspectives into very bureaucratic systems that are, by definition, I think, need to be very risk averse. In some cases, we need state dollars to be spent well, and federal dollars to be spent well. But we also really do rely on these organizations that need some amount of flexibility and nimbleness. So I've really been on both sides of that equation. So thank you for raising that.
So let me use that as a platform for asking the second question, which is, and picking up on your example of the Irvine Foundation. During the Biden administration, I know there was an acute focus on preventing fraud. And the president appointed Gene Sperling, somebody I used to work with, responsibility for that. And as far as I know, it was a remarkably clean, clear implementation with very little or almost no allegations of fraud. And so that was a result of a plan. And that plan could rely on, I'll call it pre-contract verification by a third party. In your case, the Irvine Foundation essentially is vetting you for the outside world by providing a lot of information to other funders saying, we already looked at these 6 things. Here they are on our website. You don't have to search around for the 990 in the bios. And in your experience at the state or the federal level, are there things that you would recommend either for the governor or the legislature to make it easier for the, I'll call it moderate to large nonprofits to avoid the procedural excesses without reinventing the wheel and saying, well, the state auditor should do this and the Justice Department should do that. What's worked that's simple and straightforward to implement on the fraud prevention side?
That's a great question. And I do think I think there's 2 sides. I think the Biden administration did do a very good job with that. I also think, and there's some fair criticism about how slow we were to get money out the door. So I think
the broadband program being a good example of that.
Or the infrastructure grant funding for various things. I mean, I think that's the balancing act, right? what has worked? I do know that when I was there, there was a real overhaul of the grant portal. So there were a couple of things that helped actually. One was, and one was from Congress. One was, for instance, in the bipartisan infrastructure law, Congress actually gave us the ability to hire, to kind of bypass a lot of the formal hiring processes, because that we had to bring in a lot at Department of Energy, a lot of new staff to shift from being pretty much a research and science agency to being a deployment, steel in the ground agency. And so we were able to hire about 1,000 staff through a system that Congress gave us the ability to sort of streamline applications, which actually helped a lot. So just as an example, I think thinking about legislative ability to sort of say, in this case, we have a goal as a state to do this big thing, right? To do something on homelessness, something on climate, this big thing. The legislature could say, in the 4 agencies that we're asking to implement this, we are streamlining this process. We are giving them the ability, for instance, we did some of this at the federal level, to do shared applications. If there's one project that we want and there's multiple agencies involved in it, one application instead of 4 applications for the people applying. One kind of place for all the information about the background on those people. So that's part of what we did, was a combination of making the portal for hiring and for contractors easier to use, so that the information was right there, as we talked about before. We knew information about the contractors. We knew their history contracting with the government. We knew their updated IRS forms. We had all of that in one place. And then also we were able to give folks coming in much more streamlined kind of application processes. And the federal government does a lot of background checks. So streamlining that process.
So you're kind of echoing Jennifer Palka, Recode America, which is great. Let me turn to a question that Senator Nilo raised before, which is outcomes. So Congress many years ago passed the Government Accountability Act, I think is the name of it, but it's designed to have annual reports on outcomes, and it's a paper creation exercise. No matter, and I was there trying to deal with it long ago, and it's not gotten better. So how do we improve reporting on outcomes as the counterbalance to the greater flexibility on qualifications and audit? How do we improve the delivery of real outcomes for real people?
I'm really glad you raised that. I would say it's probably the single most common comment that I've heard, and also that we've experienced, is this: the administrative burden is really tied to this minutia in reporting, where you get to a place where you're having these meetings and people are asking you, did you check this box? Is this line still correct? Is this % of staff still correct? And very, very little conversation about what you just said, which is like, what are we actually trying to do with this grant? What's the goal of the legislation? How are you accomplishing that goal? I think, and really talking to others as well, if we could, at the beginning of the grant process, I always start with the legislation. I always start, I'm a lawyer also. So I always start with, what does the statute say? It has outcomes. It's like all the whereases, all of the outcomes of the legislation. Let's start with that. How is this grant accomplishing what the legislation said we need to accomplish with this program, or what the guidelines said? And then at the front of the grant, set very clear expectations of how those outcomes will be measured. Here's what we're asking you to do. Here's the pieces that you've said you can do. Here is an advance payment. Wholeheartedly agree that's important, because people need to hire, they need to set up systems. And then at the end, and throughout the process, quarterly or annual is better. How did you achieve those? What did you actually do to accomplish the thing that the statute said, or that the guidelines said? That's what these organizations want to do. They want to be both informed at the beginning of the process, very clearly about what they'll be measured against, and they want to say what they did toward those outcomes. And they want the flexibility to say, look, something changed during this process. You and I know on the broadband work, the entire federal system changed in the middle of a bunch of grants on broadband. That's relevant to outcomes. These organizations should be able to say, state agency partner, I'm working toward this outcome, but it depended on this federal money coming in to give a huge push in this area. That's no longer here. Here is how I'm shifting and adjusting. I think that's where we should be with the narrative reports. And people would like to do them, to be totally honest. It's not just a box checking exercise. People would like to be clear about outcomes up front and clear about metrics, getting to substance at the end. What people do not want is to be held only to these very minutia sort of metrics on reporting, because it's frankly part of the culture Geoff talked about. If you trust nonprofits to do the work and get toward these shared outcomes, talk to them about that work and the shared outcomes, if that makes sense.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Good. Please continue. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I mean, we've gotten to a couple of the big things that I wanted to note, which really were around sort of process over substance, which we just talked about. You know, I did want to say a little more on this fragmented structure and process point. I do think that there's a need for a focus on aligning grants toward major outcomes. So if there's multiple agencies that have a piece of a state goal, then actually allowing them to do a single grant application, to do blended funding. That's not easy for them to do. I know this from the agency side. It's really hard to get Department of Finance to allow you to do blended funding, but it was hard at the federal level. OMB had a hard time with it, past that. And I think probably the legislature needs to show leadership on that. If there's a major goal being advanced and the legislature saying this agency needs to coordinate with these 4 agencies, we see this all the time, put in there also in that coordination, they have the ability to blend funding toward these key outcomes, list the outcomes, use those outcomes for your grant metrics. I think that's just really important and would reduce burden and taxpayer stress, frankly, across the board. So the only other things that we didn't get to just on in terms of key recommendations, really recommending that establishing a 15% minimum indirect rate. This is what the federal government does. Many of these folks also have federal grants. Let's just be honest about what the indirect costs really are. They are very, very important to these organizations. I'm on a lot of nonprofit boards as well, as many of you. I see this all, board management is an indirect cost, right? I mean, all these things are indirect costs. They're all extremely important to the health and stability of organizations. This unified state grant portal with basic information seems like an obvious thing to do, and a place where all of us, you and I, could go check the health of an organization with basic 990s audit reports, insurance. Reducing frequency of reporting where it makes sense to annual, which is what most philanthropy does, not quarterly. If it has to be quarterly because it's changing conditions, make it quarterly, but again, with those key metrics in place to be really the focus of the reporting. Standardizing those advanced payment protocols. I think we talked about that before, but advanced payment of 25% for any grant over 100,000 with clear budget modification processes makes sense. Advanced payment is really helpful. I'll tell you, just when I bring in a new grant, I usually have to hire. The whole process of hiring is incredibly burdensome on the team. Having the ability to do that with advanced payment for the project is really important. I like the idea of this, like a rating system for contractors, sort of like we do often in the private sector world of, making sure that the folks you're contracting with on the nonprofit side don't have some huge scandal, didn't have a huge labor violation, didn't have a fraud claim, giving people some kind of a period of time where after some claim happens and they've had a whole staff and board turnover that they can get back on the list. I mean, these are fairly standard operations. I see a hand, so I'll
There you go. Yep. Commissioner Hernandez.
Thank you, and great presentation. I mean, I've had some background in some nonprofits, but on this rating aspect, Attorney General, so all nonprofits have to interact with Attorney General. Do you think there's a role in the Attorney General's office to do some of this rating, or do you think it's beyond their scope?
Yeah, that's a great question. It's a great question. I mean, I don't know if it's a question where it's necessary, I guess. I think like at a baseline level, you've all talked about this already, but I mean, we already have to do audits. We get audited every year. We are already through a bunch of other grants we have to do, doing background checks on every employee. We're already doing, a number of these levels of compliance. So I think a lot of it is just built into the system, frankly. It's not easy to survive as a nonprofit in California. So, you're sort of seeing the ones that are able to survive really kind of rising to the top. Honestly, it's a particularly difficult time for nonprofits right now. So I'm not sure the Attorney General, I mean, if there's like a fraud claim or something, yes, I think that to the extent that there's something that gets triggered criminally, we should know about it. It's a great point, but I'm not exactly sure how that, I would worry about creating another layer of administration.
It's just that they already interact with
Yeah.
the nonprofits, so it's
Yeah.
great that they would maybe create that database we were talking about, so we have an understanding. Have they interacted with the state in the past? Have they received grants in the past? How has that process been? And so forth.
Yeah, I think that's smart. And maybe even somebody said this earlier, but some kind of a tiered system where, look, if you're sending out millions of dollars to an organization, I do think there should be, including, by the way, consultants who take a lot of this work that I don't think they need to, because I think one of the other recommendations that we had that I feel very strongly about is you have a lot of NGO partners to the state who've been working with the state for a long time, who are trusted partners. Trust them to help with evaluation and thinking through, the future of programs. We do not need to bring in McKinsey every time. We do not need to bring in BCG every time. But when you do bring in those groups, you're spending millions of dollars on them. Let's hold them to the standards that you're holding these small nonprofits, right? I mean, I think it's really important to say if you are sending millions of dollars out or a major multi-year grant, should be a higher bar than for these sort of smaller nonprofits that are very nimble and very community focused and are able to kind of be at a place that the bigger organizations cannot be. So maybe a tiered system, to your question. Also, those larger, to the senator's earlier point, those larger organizations are much more able to deal with a little bit of additional delay when it comes to sort of, checks or interaction with the AG, for instance. So I think that's an interesting idea. Thank you, Chair. I think the only other thing that I wanted to say, because I did want to make that point about trusting these NGOs, we are spending at the state millions on outside consultants to evaluate programs and processes. I can tell you that there are organizations that you've worked with, and including the community foundations, which play a really important role in the state of sort of knowing all the players. They're the hub of the hub and spoke at the regional level of most of these nonprofits. Those types of organizations can really play a role in evaluation and in sort of program design at kind of key points in a program. I think let's think about relying a little bit on them. It both helps those organizations and communities, many of which are in underserved parts of the state, Central California, Inland California, rural California. That is not where the big consultants are located. I think it's great to drive some sort of funding and support and capacity to these parts of the state that do not have as much philanthropy support, but really know the issues of these areas of the state better than, many of us and many of folks sitting in Sacramento do. I'd love to see the state really elevate some of these nonprofits that really do have, to our earlier point, a great track record, history with the state, significant work on outcomes. So those are my main points. I will provide written notes to all of you after the call, but I really appreciate being here.
Great. Thank you very much. And thank you for your contribution. Much appreciated. Crystal.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Our final witness today is Stacey Wiggall, who is the Director of Training and Technical Assistance for the National Alliance of Trauma Recovery Centers. Welcome, Stacey. When you're ready, please unmute yourself and turn on your video. And thank you for testifying today.
Hi, thank you. I think it took me a minute to rejoin as a panelist, but I would very much like to thank the Commission for inviting me to speak today about my organization's experiences with the state on grant management issues. I am the Director of Training and Technical Assistance for the National Alliance of Trauma Recovery Centers at UCSF, and my team and I work with the 55 TRCs across the country, as well as the 21 trauma recovery centers in the state of California. And so that's really what I'm going to be focusing on today and what I have to share. I've witnessed both the inception and the growth of the Trauma Recovery Center grant program in California since its inception in 2013. And that is when the California Victim Compensation Board was tasked with operationalizing state legislation that was passed to replicate the UCSF TRC model and to grow a network of TRCs across the state in California. And I would like to share some background about the TRCs and their work with the commission, just because it's relevant for some of the issues that I'm going to be mentioning. In California and elsewhere, the people and communities, as we understand, that are the most harmed by violence and crime are also generally the least helped. And the TRC model was developed to serve these survivors of violence and crime who typically fall through the cracks of victim services, generally face insurmountable barriers to being able to access victim compensation benefits, and are also not well served by traditional mental health services because they have a focus on talk therapy alone, often as a treatment for PTSD and trauma. TRCs provide wraparound and comprehensive care in a trusted and community-centered environment. And they also use a non-siloed approach to victim services, which is different from most victim services in California and elsewhere. They serve survivors of gun violence, domestic violence, sexual violence, human trafficking, physical assault, any criminal motor vehicle accidents, and also homicide loss. And by combining assertive outreach to survivors out in the community with clinical case management to be able to address the practical needs that are often the most prominent for many survivors of violent crime, with care coordination across the many systems and agencies that many survivors are navigating after violent crime, and evidence-based mental health therapies that are delivered with a trauma-informed approach to be able to really treat the symptoms of PTSD and other sequelae of trauma with therapies that we know work. TRCs make a real difference in people's lives. This is an evidence-based model, and research has demonstrated that the impacts of this model include significantly higher rates of engagement in services, significant decreases in post-traumatic stress disorder and depression, the ability to return to work sooner, decreases in substance use, and improved quality of life. And in every community where a TRC opens, it becomes an essential component of safety net services for trauma recovery. The NATRC has witnessed multiple grant administration issues in the California TRC grant program that not only negatively impact the trauma recovery centers and their teams, but also survivors of violence in California. And so there are 4 challenges actually that I would like to mention here today. One is the CalVCB's expansion of the Trauma Recovery Center network by consistently defunding well-performing TRCs in order to fund new programs. In this last grant cycle in March, 6 trauma recovery centers were defunded, and most of them actually, for a technicality in their grant application, which was missing a required sentence confirming their capacity to provide services within 30 days of receiving a grant award. It's clear to us that requiring existing programs to repeatedly state their ability to begin serving clients within 30 days of receiving a grant award should be a moot point, because this question isn't relevant for existing programs who are providing ongoing services, and it doesn't have anything to do with their demonstrated performance and the services that they're offering. We do know that whenever a TRC closes, it harms the underserved communities that are most impacted by violent crime. It abruptly discontinues these very needed services, it disrupts community trust, and it creates additional barriers to care. We also think that closing successful established trauma recovery centers for technicalities is not a good use of the state's resources, as it takes a lot of investment to build up and staff up and develop a trauma recovery center. To address this issue, we recommend that the CalVCB amend their grant process to prioritize funding for well-performing programs. That could be done by using for example, a 10-point bonus system for performing TRCs, which is how the state of New Jersey does it. And we have provided sample NOFA language to the CalVCB to demonstrate how this can be done. It could also happen by amending the grant application process to reorient questions and scoring toward performing TRCs instead of how it's now oriented toward new grant applicants who are the only applicants who should really need to demonstrate their capacity to serve clients within 30 days of receiving a grant award. And I see a couple of hands, so I'm going to pause.
Yeah, let's go to Commissioner Hernandez. Thank you.
Thank you for being here. Quick question, just clarification. In terms of TRCs, I know some are nonprofit, but some say they're hospitals and some are attorney district offices. Is that correct? Or do they sub-grant them out afterwards?
That's a good question. This is a model of care which can be implemented by community-based organizations or by behavioral health centers that are hospital-based or hospital-affiliated. The grants have also been awarded to some family justice centers to develop a TRC, so that might also be either co-located or affiliated with the district attorney's office.
Okay.
Yeah.
I want to see if Gil wanted to apply, that's why.
Thank you. Thank you. Please continue.
Okay. A second issue, which we see with the grant process for trauma recovery centers, but may apply to other state grant processes as well, is the exclusion of subject matter experts from either grant materials development or application review process, grant management process. We really believe it's a best practice for grant administration to include the expertise and voices and experiences of subject matter experts in the grant management process, rather than having kind of a more insular group of state employees who may or may not have expertise in a particular area or model or service provision. For TRCs, that would include survivors of violent crime, representatives from multiple California TRCs, and UCSF TRC model experts. And so we recommend that the CalVCB create an advisory board that would include all of these subject matter experts to inform the grant management process, ideally, and meet regularly, perhaps quarterly. Because these are issues that are not new and that we've been observing over the years since the grant program has existed in California, we would also recommend that the advisory board be created sooner rather than later to help adjust course. A third issue is that there's been a change from the CalVCB within the last several years to disallow grant funds to cover staff salary during time spent at trainings or in professional development activities. It's kind of an example of things really not aligning in terms of priority. Programs are allowed to use money to pay a trainer, for example, but they're not allowed to cover their staff's time to attend the training. This is a change in grant management practice that's not based on legislation. Previously, they did allow the TRCs to cover this cost, but for some reason that shifted and that's created a significant barrier. And this is important for the trauma recovery centers, not only because they're providing mental health services and ongoing training is mandatory for all mental health clinical licenses. But we also know that it's essential, it's a best practice for all staff roles and being able to both provide high quality services and to stay current with best practices and innovations in trauma treatment. So we'd like to see that amended. And lastly, legislation in California around the TRCs permits that the grant cycle be up to 3 years. But from the beginning, it's been a 2-year grant cycle, which is problematic because a shorter cycle creates barriers for staffing and hiring in that second year due to funding uncertainty. It's much harder to hire new team members when you can't assure them that they're going to be employed for more than a year. And it also places an administrative burden on programs that detracts from their focus on service delivery, their primary focus. It also really places an administrative burden on the grant management staff who are also having to develop and manage and administer this grant award process over a shorter period of time. So we would recommend that they increase the grant cycle to 3 years since that's permitted by legislation. And to do that, they'd also have to appropriately allocate 3 years worth of grant funding to these programs. When we've brought up this issue in the past, the response has been that they don't want to shortchange the TRCs, that they would have to give them only 2 years worth of funding, but stretch it out over 3 years. So obviously that change would need to be made to match accordingly. So I don't know if there are any other questions around any of that.
Well, I do want to ask you something, and this is, I got to do it before David Byer does it, and then I'll go to Commissioner Garcetti. But I think that when you first started, you said there are 55 TRCs across the country and 21 in California.
That's right. 20 of which are funded by the state in California, and another that has found other resources to continue operating after being defunded in the spring. But yes.
So insofar as your recommendations, are there other states that you think that we should look to that have processes that are aligned with your recommendations, so that California could look there and say, look, it's working in XYZ states, maybe we can model ourselves after that?
Absolutely. We have established trauma recovery centers in the state of New Jersey, also in the state of Michigan. We have them in Illinois, although they've had a lot of transition in their with the funder at the state level who oversees this program, so that might not be as helpful of a resource right now. And the NATRC at UCSF has relationships with these funders in other states, so we'd be happy to facilitate those connections in order to have that cross-learning and sharing of best practices.
Great, thank you. Commissioner Garcetti.
Oh, Ms. Wiggall, thank you for coming in and spending your time with us. I'm familiar with your organizations, but I can't answer my own question that I have, and that is, your TRCs handle trauma cases of those individuals who've just left or been out for a year of state prison after long incarcerations?
That's a good question. The Trauma Recovery Center model really has focused on eligibility, has focused on being a victim or survivor of violent crime. And so if that person, after re-release into the community, had that experience, they would be eligible for TRCs. But the way the model is currently set up is that we know that prison experiences are generally very traumatic, and it's probably quite likely that this person has experienced violence in that context, but that in and of itself wouldn't be a reason for eligibility to get treatment at the TRC. I can just share too that these programs, there's a very high need for these services, and in general TRC, I think they would love to broaden their eligibility, but couldn't do so without additional resources. Most TRCs have significant waits and are managing wait lists for their current eligibility criteria.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, I also note that in your written testimony, you do very specifically outline areas of issues and proposals for remedies. So that's going to be very helpful to us. Let me look at other commissioners. Any other commissioners have any questions before we conclude this part of the meeting? I don't see any. So thank you for your testimony. Much appreciated. Thank you for taking the time to share it with us.
Thank you to the commission also.
Okay, Ethan, I think is this public comment time?
That is correct, Mr. Chairman. We'll move to the public comment session of the agenda. If you have joined the meeting via Zoom, please use the raised hand function. Raise your hand now if you wish to make public comment. If you have phoned into the meeting, you need to email us immediately at littlehoover@lhc.ca.gov. littlehoover@lhc.ca.gov. That address is now on your screen. Give us your phone number so we know who to unmute. But if you've joined by Zoom, please use the raised hand function. That is much preferable. Public comment is limited to 3 minutes per speaker, and the commissioners will be able to hear you but not see you if you make public comment. I believe we have no public commenters in the physical location, so I'll ask Shara to identify the first public commenter online.
Our first speaker will be Michelle Magar. You now have the ability to unmute yourself.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes, we can.
Okay. Let me go ahead and read this aloud because I wanted to make sure it would fit within 3 minutes. Thank you for calling on me, and more importantly, for this excellent presentation. Like others who've spoken, I've also served on nonprofit boards and have seen the problems discussed today from all sides of the issue, because I've also been a staff attorney for California nonprofits. And before graduating from a Bay Area law school 3 decades ago, I spent 14 years covering civil rights as an award-winning national news reporter focused on civil rights coverage for NPR and national print outlets. Here are my 2 brief points, which are relevant but somewhat outside the box of the discussion I've heard to date on this Zoom presentation. First, re-identifying best practices nationwide, as Commissioner David Beer and other commissioners have been asking each of your presenters. Please consider asking California's Center for Investigative Reporting in Emeryville to fund an in-depth piece that might provide more helpful, specific recommendations after spending weeks of research and dozens of interviews to come up with those specific ideas of proven innovative ideas that California might be able to adapt. And if they are too busy, I'd also recommend suggesting the story idea request to ProPublica, our nation's best funded nonprofit. That was created by Bay Area philanthropists to ensure investigative reporting didn't completely disappear, since it's the most expensive type of reporting possible. Second idea, or rather comment I have, is about better stewardship of scarce foundation dollars. Please consider setting up a California nonprofit legal defense fund. Here's why. In my world of fair housing law, nonprofits can be organizational plaintiffs in lawsuits that request frustration of mission damages. If a judge rules in favor of the nonprofit plaintiff, their legal team can request reimbursement for every single minute of staff time and resource use the nonprofit spent curing, say, one specific large multifamily slumlord's discriminatory housing practices. That would violate the agency's mission of fighting housing discrimination broadly by forcing staff to focus their talents on one specific wrongdoer, which is a frustration of their mission, so is compensated in the same manner that civil rights laws allow judges to force wrongdoers to cover the legal fees of a successful lawsuit by a person who is suing under any kind of civil rights law, both federal and California. So in sum, a pooled fund that would front legal challenges by nonprofits could also support our state's best nonprofits gain reimbursement for their hard work, while also having a deterrent impact that might make wrongdoers, like slumlords, think twice when they ignore requests from nonprofits to stop discriminating. Frustration of mission.
Ma'am, your 3 minutes has expired. If you can wrap up very quickly, please.
Yep, I have just one more sentence. Frustration of mission of damages are available outside the fair housing world, and any grants to jumpstart legal challenges could be recycled and reused when a case succeeds. Please check out the Impact Fund that has been pioneering the successful model.
Thank you, ma'am.
For decades now. Thank you for this opportunity to present.
Sheriff, we can move on to the next speaker, please.
Yes, the next speaker will be Purva Bhattacharjee. You now have the ability to unmute yourself.
Hi, I'm Purva Bhattacharjee with the California Alliance of Child and Family Services, representing over 160 nonprofit agencies providing critical services to children, youth, and families across the state. We really appreciate the issue brief and the conversation today, highlighting challenges with delayed payments. For our providers working across multiple counties, different child welfare contracts, and funding streams, this often creates administrative burdens and delayed payments, leaving organizations unpaid for services that they've already delivered. On top of this, our agencies are experiencing much higher overhead and indirect costs due to an unprecedented insurance crisis. Last fall, foster family agencies who serve more than 7,000 higher needs foster youth lost coverage from the Nonprofit Insurance Alliance of California last fall. A joint survey by our organization and the State Department of Social Services found that liability insurance costs jumped an average of $163,000 per agency in 1 year. As a result, 60% of FFAs have expected to cut capacity or close programs, and nearly a third have already laid off staff. This directly threatens family reunification and permanency outcomes and services for children in the child welfare system. To prevent the collapse of the safety net, we successfully advocated for a bridge investment in the state budget to sustain FFAs for the next year. But this is only a short-term fix and only one stream of programming. The insurance crisis is impacting nonprofits across sectors, increasing their overhead and indirect costs immensely. And California isn't alone. And other states are also grappling with this issue as well. The Alliance is working with partners and state departments to learn from these efforts and develop long-term solutions for the insurance crisis. So we encourage future research and reports to look into this issue as well, and for nonprofits to collaborate more on how to address the insurance crisis as well at large. Thank you.
Our next speaker will be Rachel Mueller. You now have the ability to unmute yourself.
Thank you, everyone. My name is Rachel Mueller. I'm speaking today on behalf of Rural Community Assistance Corporation, Self-Help Enterprises, and the California Coalition for Community Investment, which is a coalition of more than 50 community development financial institutions, or CDFIs. Together, we are strong supporters of the efforts of the Nonprofit Equity Initiative led by Cal Nonprofits. First, I want to thank the commissioners for the great feedback and questions today. And I think it gives us a lot of information to think over together as a group. And really want to thank the panelists for sharing their expertise on these important issues affecting the strength and stability of our sector. Most important, I think, is the treatment, the fair treatment of our indirect costs. Too often, these nonprofits are underpaid and denied reimbursement for essential overhead, as we've discussed, and this discourages them from taking on contracts and weakens their long-term stability. In addition, I just want to highlight that California does rely on nonprofits to be our frontline partners for delivering a lot of critical services like housing, clean drinking water, health, community development. The state's contracting system often makes this a difficult partnership, as you've heard today. And many nonprofits typically must front costs and wait months for reimbursement, which forces them to turn to other sources to provide this funding. In the meantime, some of them do reach out to CDFIs like the ones that are in our coalition, and CDFIs help those projects keep moving. But these community development loans do come with interest rates as well, which nonprofits can't recover through their contracts. It should be highly concerning that nonprofits are forced to borrow with interest just to conduct work on behalf of the states. Some nonprofits do go to private lenders, which can end up paying much more. So advanced pay, prompt payment would prevent things like this, which would save California nonprofits hundreds of thousands of dollars. And this is not just a problem for the nonprofits that CDFIs serve. It is also a problem for CDFIs as well as community lenders. Their capital is then tied up in these lines of credit, when it could instead go into productive investments in affordable housing and small business. So in other words, providing this gap financing for state contracts limits the impact CDFIs can also have on community development projects. We just urge this group to continue to dig into these issues, and really thank everyone on the commission and the senator for their comments today. Thank you so much.
Our next speaker will be Heidi Strunk. You now have the ability to unmute yourself.
Thank you. And thank you, Commission, for holding this very important hearing this morning. I'm Heidi Strunk. I'm the CEO of Mental Health America of California. We've been leading Californians since our incorporation in 1957. We're also a member of Cal Nonprofits and thank all the witnesses for their testimony today. We strongly echo all the testimony. I'd like to give you one example that touches upon numerous areas of prior witnesses. Delayed payments have been particularly challenging for us. I know many nonprofits who would not have been able to weather such a challenge. I want to give you one example that affected us last year. Last fiscal year, defined for us July 1, 24 through June 30, 25, we carried a combined aging accounts receivable for multiple contracts with the state in a combined amount of $945,000 for over 7 months. There are a number of variables that contributed to this issue. We were limited to only invoice or across all these contracts on only a quarterly basis. And processing these payments were grossly delayed by multiple departments across the state. Of interest, based on what I was told by contract managers of when they forwarded our approved payments to the controller didn't seem to be part of the delay problem. The controller seemed to always process payments within 2 to 3 weeks of receiving those from the departments of the state. And then to speak to the issue of onerous reporting, prior to our approval for payment, not only do we have to submit very detailed invoices, but also reports in support of those invoices and in-depth quarterly reports and extensive annual reports. The other quick point I would like to touch on that audits are costly and also can be onerous as well. One suggestion, if the state moves forward to require smaller organizations, meaning those with budgets under $2 million, that perhaps to provide those contractors front those monies while extending those indirect costs to cover the cost of that audit, so that we can allow for those smaller nonprofits to continue to participate in the contracts of the state providing the services to Californians that the state cannot provide. I'd like to thank you for your time and your attention to this very important matter.
Thank you very much,
We have no further public comment.
Thank you. So, Mr. Chairman, we've completed our agenda for today. I will just note before turning back to you that the next meeting of the commission is September 25th in person here in Sacramento, and that will focus on the state's response to financial scams, the study requested by Senator Grayson and several other members of the legislature. We also hope to have the electricity cost report, the draft report, to come before the full commission at that meeting. So September 25th in Sacramento. And other than that, Mr. Chairman, we've completed the agenda.
Great, thank you. And I would be remiss if I didn't mention that with respect to the issues of nonprofits, I did speak about Assemblymember Greg Hart, but also Assemblymember Bennett has exerted some leadership on the issue of nonprofit payments and trying to make this whole thing work better. I want to thank my fellow commissioners for their participation. It was a pleasure to see you. Please stay well and look forward to seeing you in September.